It was a quiet evening in the city, the kind of night when lights shimmered on the streets, and the air smelled faintly of rain mixed with the aroma of food from nearby restaurants. He was no ordinary man walking through those streets. Far from it. He was a billionaire, a man whose name alone could fill magazines, whose life was watched, photographed, and gossiped about constantly. But tonight, none of that mattered to him. Tonight, he wanted to be invisible. He stepped out of his sleek, black car parked in front of the busy restaurant. Normally, a limousine, security, and flashing cameras would follow him everywhere, but he had arranged for none of that tonight. He wanted nothing more than a normal experience, a normal meal, and maybe, just maybe, a normal conversation with someone who had no idea who he really was. To make this possible, he had to disguise himself carefully. He didn't need a mask or a fake beard. He needed something simpler, something ordinary enough that people would glance at him and think, just another guy. He chose a simple baseball cap, pulled low over his forehead, hiding the familiar features that could be recognized by anyone who had seen him on television or in magazines. He wore a plain hoodie, soft and gray, that could blend into the crowd easily. His designer shoes, though expensive, were a muted black, nothing flashy to draw attention. Even his posture, normally upright and commanding, was slightly slouched to seem casual. Every detail mattered because he knew the world judged him instantly by appearances. As he walked toward the restaurant, he noticed how differently he experienced the world in this disguise. People passed by him without a second glance. A group of teenagers laughed on the sidewalk. A delivery man hurried past carrying boxes. Even a woman pushing a stroller barely acknowledged him. In his normal life, this would have been impossible. People always noticed him. Cameras always followed. But now, it was as if he were invisible, and it felt strangely freeing. He paused outside the restaurant for a moment, taking in the lights and sounds. The sign flickered softly, the windows steamed slightly from the warmth inside. He could see a few diners laughing and talking through the glass. The smell of grilled meat and spices drifted out to the street, making his stomach rumble. He smiled to himself. Tonight, he wasn't a billionaire. He was just another person wanting a steak. He pushed the door open slowly, letting himself merge with the crowd inside. The atmosphere of the restaurant was cozy, with soft lighting and the low hum of conversation. It was nothing extravagant, no red carpets, no elite clientele dressed in suits and gowns, but it was perfect for what he wanted. He wanted to be part of a world that existed far away from boardrooms, stock markets, and public scrutiny. As he moved toward an empty table, he noticed the staff moving efficiently, unaware of who he was. The waitresses chatted quietly among themselves. The cooks shouted orders to each other in the kitchen, and the regular customers were lost in their own worlds. For the first time in years, he could observe people without them noticing him. He could see how they laughed, how they argued gently over small things, how they cared for each other in ordinary ways. It was a small window into a world he had almost forgotten existed, a world where people weren't judging him for what he owned or who he knew. He chose a corner table, one that offered a clear view of the room. It wasn't for surveillance. It was for observation, curiosity, and a little bit of entertainment. He could watch life unfold in its simplest forms, unnoticed, and it was thrilling in a way he hadn't felt in years. There was a strange joy in being anonymous, in not being followed, in not being the subject of every conversation. Tonight, he was free. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his disguise settle comfortably over him. It wasn't just clothing. It was a shield, a way to experience the world differently. He wasn't thinking about business deals, stock prices, or his public image. He wasn't thinking about how much money he had or what people thought of him. He was simply a man walking into a restaurant for a meal, blending into the crowd, watching life happen around him, and feeling normal. Little did he know, this night, this simple disguise, would lead him to a moment he would never forget. A moment where a single interaction, a whisper, and a seemingly ordinary waitress would shake him in ways even his vast wealth and influence could not. But for now, he was just sitting quietly, waiting for a server, enjoying the rare thrill of anonymity, and savoring the small pleasure of being invisible. He settled into his corner seat, the leather of the chair creaking softly under his weight, and scanned the menu with a casual interest. Though he already knew exactly what he wanted, he had walked into this restaurant craving something familiar, something simple yet satisfying. A perfectly cooked steak, something that could ground him in the ordinary world for a little while. He noticed the ambient sounds, the clatter of dishes, the low hum of conversation, the occasional laughter echoing from a nearby table, and felt a strange sense of calm he hadn't experienced in years. When the waitress arrived, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her steps measured and precise, and he observed her for a moment, studying how she interacted with other diners, how her smile could light up a table, how her attentiveness made her seem like she genuinely cared. There was something about her that caught his attention immediately, though he couldn't quite name it. Perhaps it was her energy, or maybe it was the way she seemed to notice small details others overlooked. Either way, he knew this meal would be more than just food. It might become an experience he would never forget. "I'll have the ribeye, medium rare, please," he said, keeping his voice casual, smooth, and steady, careful not to reveal any trace of authority or wealth. The waitress nodded politely, jotting down his order with a small smile, and he noticed the way her eyes seemed to linger for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, almost as if she sensed there was something unusual about him, but couldn't quite place it. He felt a thrill at the idea that, even in disguise, his presence could ripple through the ordinary. While waiting for his steak, he allowed himself to observe more closely, noticing the rhythm of the restaurant, the flow of orders, the tiny gestures of kindness exchanged between staff and customers. He saw a young couple laughing over a shared dessert, a man gesturing wildly as he recounted a story to his friends, and an elderly woman quietly sipping her tea, savoring the peace of the evening. These moments, small and ordinary, felt almost magical to him, a stark contrast to the constant chaos of his own life filled with meetings, press, and obligations. He couldn't help but wonder about the people around him, their lives, their struggles, and their joys. He imagined what they would think if they knew who he really was, if they knew that the man sitting quietly, dressed plainly, was a billionaire whose decisions could impact thousands. He smiled inwardly at the thought, feeling a rare sense of freedom in being unknown, unrecognized, and just part of the crowd. For once, he didn't have to be anyone but himself. When the steak arrived, it was perfect, the aroma rich and inviting, the sizzle still faintly audible as it rested on the plate. He picked up his fork and knife, but paused, observing how the waitress carefully placed it in front of him, her movements precise, almost ritualistic. There was a grace in her simplicity, a quiet professionalism that seemed to command respect without demanding it. He realized that moments like this, small and seemingly ordinary, were often more powerful than any grand gesture or expensive display. As he cut into the steak, juices spilling slightly onto the plate, he felt a sudden sense of anticipation, not just for the taste, but for what was to come. He had a feeling that this meal, this ordinary-looking restaurant, and this unassuming waitress were going to change something within him, though he couldn't yet understand how. The ordinary had a way of surprising him tonight, and he was ready to be surprised, ready to experience life in a way that no boardroom or luxury penthouse could ever provide. He took his first bite, savoring the flavor, and leaned back slightly, letting the warmth of the restaurant and the comfort of the food wash over him. In that moment, he was not a billionaire, not a public figure, not a man burdened by responsibility or expectation. He was simply a man having a meal, quietly observing, quietly living, and unknowingly waiting for the one whisper that would stop him cold. The waitress approached his table with a calm confidence, balancing her tray with ease as she moved between the bustling diners. She was young, but there was a quiet strength about her, a sharpness in her eyes that made it clear she noticed everything. Even the way the man in the corner chair, dressed plainly in a hoodie and cap, seemed different. Her curiosity was piqued, though she would never admit it aloud. She had learned to read people over the years, spotting the little tells that revealed more than words ever could, and something about him whispered that he was not like the others. As she set the water glass in front of him, she glanced up briefly, and their eyes met for just a second. It was a fleeting moment, but he felt it like a small jolt, a quiet recognition that he wasn't entirely invisible. She smiled politely, but it was more than a social gesture. There was awareness behind it, a spark of understanding that she couldn't yet explain. He returned the smile, though guarded, curious about what she had sensed. While she moved on to take another table's order, He couldn't help but watch her, noticing the way she interacted with everyone, the subtle gestures that made her stand out, the way she leaned slightly when listening, nodded just enough to show attentiveness, and remembered small details about customers' preferences. It was a skill honed over countless shifts, a talent born from empathy and observation, and it drew him in. He had met countless people of influence, people who demanded attention, or faked charm, but she had something genuine, something unforced that he rarely encountered. She returned shortly, placing his steak in front of him with practiced precision. He inhaled the aroma, and then looked up at her. Meeting her gaze once again, he noticed her pause, a brief hesitation that seemed deliberate, subtle, almost like she had something important to say, but was deciding how to say it. That hesitation caught him off guard, stirring a strange mix of anticipation and unease. For a man who had always been in control, this tiny moment of unpredictability was both thrilling and unnerving. "Is everything all right with your order?" she asked softly, her voice carrying warmth but also a quiet edge of curiosity. He nodded, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, thank you. It looks perfect," he said, and her eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. She was reading him, even if she didn't know exactly who he was, sensing a tension beneath the calm exterior, the weight of unspoken stories, the invisible burden of someone used to commanding the world around him. As she moved away again, he watched her disappear into the flow of the restaurant. Yet he felt a pull, a magnetic curiosity about her. There was a presence in her that demanded attention without asking for it, a subtle intelligence that made ordinary interactions feel charged with meaning. For the first time in a long while, he realized that he wanted more than just a meal tonight. He wanted to understand her, to see how she saw the world, and perhaps, in some small way, to be seen himself. Throughout the meal, he continued to steal glances at her, observing her interactions with others. But now he also wondered about her story, her life outside the restaurant, the dreams she held quietly for herself. She moved with purpose but without hurry, managing the chaos of orders, complaints, and requests effortlessly, and it struck him how rare it was to meet someone so grounded, so real, in a world filled with pretense and performance. Then, as she returned to refill his water glass, something shifted in the air, a subtle tension that made him sit up slightly, leaning forward without meaning to. He sensed that the moment was coming, the one that would change the ordinary into the extraordinary. Her presence alone had already stirred something within him, but he couldn't know that the next word she whispered would stop him in his tracks, leaving a mark he would never forget. The waitress, unaware of the storm she was about to unleash in the life of a man who had controlled everything around him, prepared to speak, and in that quiet, ordinary moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The waitress leaned slightly closer, her movements casual, almost imperceptible to anyone else in the restaurant, but not to him. He noticed the shift in her posture, the subtle way she angled her body, the slight pause before she spoke, and it made his pulse quicken. He had expected nothing more than polite conversation or a routine interaction, yet in that small moment, something extraordinary hung in the air, as if the world itself had slowed down just for them. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet it carried a weight that seemed to penetrate through his carefully constructed walls. "You don't belong here pretending to be someone you're not," she said, barely audible to anyone else, but clear and precise to him. Her words were simple, ordinary even, yet they struck him with the force of a thunderbolt, freezing him mid-bite. He blinked, momentarily unsure if he had heard correctly, or if the fatigue of life's constant pressure had finally caught up to him. The whisper was more than words. It was recognition, understanding, and judgment all rolled into one. It was the acknowledgement of a truth he had spent years avoiding, a truth that even his wealth and influence could not erase. He had disguised himself tonight to observe life, to step away from the power he wielded, but he had not expected to be confronted so directly, so effortlessly, by a stranger. His chest tightened, a mix of surprise, vulnerability, and admiration flooding through him. He looked at her, truly looked, seeing not just a waitress, but someone who seemed to see through him, past the clothes, past the cap, past the persona he had built to navigate the world. She had spoken without fear, without knowing the consequences. Yet her words carried a weight far heavier than any conversation he had ever had in boardrooms or luxury offices. There was honesty in her whisper, a clarity he had longed for but never allowed himself to encounter. For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath, the sounds of the restaurant fading into the background, the clatter of dishes, the chatter of other diners, the hum of conversation. All of it became distant, and all that remained was her voice and the truth it carried. He felt a cold shiver run down his spine, a visceral reaction to a truth he had tried to ignore, and yet, in that moment, he could not deny it, could not push it away, could not escape the realization that his life, despite its riches and power, had been missing something essential, something human and unpretentious. He wanted to respond, to say something witty, something that could restore control, but no words came. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. As if the simple act of speaking might shatter the fragile spell, he realized that for the first time in years, he was not in control, not of the situation, not of his emotions, not even of the thoughts racing through his mind. The whisper had done what no amount of money, fame, or influence ever could. It had unsettled him completely, leaving him exposed, raw, and entirely human. The waitress straightened then, her job done. Unaware of the storm she had just ignited within him, she moved to attend another table, her steps measured and calm, as though nothing had happened. But he remained frozen in his chair, staring at the spot where she had been, the words echoing in his mind like a refrain he could not escape. He realized that a life of power could provide comfort, luxury, and even admiration, but it could never replace the piercing clarity of an honest moment, the undeniable force of someone who sees you as you truly are. He reached for his fork again, but hesitated, his appetite waning in the wake of her whisper. He chewed slowly, savoring the flavor, but it was distant now, almost irrelevant. His mind was racing, reflecting on choices, priorities, and the invisible walls he had built around himself for decades. In that small, ordinary restaurant, in that quiet, fleeting moment, he had been reminded of something extraordinary. That wealth could never shield him from truth, and that sometimes, the most ordinary people could wield the most profound power. He sat back in his chair, stunned, unsettled, and deeply alive, knowing instinctively that this brief encounter would linger in his mind far longer than any business deal, any headline, or any luxury he had ever known. For her, it was just another shift, another customer, another whispered remark, but for him, it was a moment that would echo through the rest of his life, a whisper that had frozen him cold, and a lesson he would never forget. He sat frozen in his chair, the fork halfway to his mouth, the steak untouched. As the weight of her whisper settled over him like an unexpected storm, his heart raced, not with fear, but with something far stranger, a mix of shock, realization, and awe. He had spent years mastering control over every aspect of his life, commanding boardrooms, negotiating billions, and managing the perception of the world around him. Yet in that single moment, all of it seemed powerless, irrelevant. He had been stopped cold by a stranger who had spoken barely above a whisper, and the sheer force of it left him trembling inside. For a few seconds, he simply stared, struggling to process what had just happened. The words echoed in his mind, repeating over and over, as if each repetition peeled back another layer of the armor he had built around himself. The whisper had done what no person, no money, no achievement had ever done. It had pierced straight through his carefully constructed identity and touched the part of him he kept hidden, the part that longed for honesty, for connection, for a life that mattered beyond wealth and status. He tried to speak, to formulate some response, but the words stuck in his throat. His usual confidence, the calm control that had defined him for decades, had vanished, leaving only raw, human vulnerability. He felt a shiver run down his spine, a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning or the evening breeze. It was a coldness born from realization, from confrontation with a truth he had long avoided, a truth that now stared him squarely in the face. His mind raced through memories, choices, and moments of his life. The whisper had unlocked something buried deep, a reminder of missed opportunities, of moments where he had prioritized wealth over people, control over kindness, appearances over authenticity. He saw flashes of himself in boardrooms and private jets, making decisions that mattered to the world, but rarely to the heart. And in the midst of that reflection, he felt a profound pang of regret, not for the money he had earned, but for the humanity he had neglected, the connections he had ignored. Even the diners around him seemed to blur into the background, their laughter and chatter fading to a dull hum. The restaurant, which had once felt ordinary and safe, now felt charged with significance. Every sound, every movement, every subtle glance from the staff seemed amplified, yet none of it mattered as much as the memory of her words. Her whisper had shifted something within him, something invisible but powerful, something that demanded attention and acknowledgement. He felt both frightened and exhilarated, as if he had stumbled into a new reality he had never imagined. He leaned back in his chair, trying to regain composure, but the sensation of being unsettled refused to leave. His body remained tense, his thoughts spiraling. Yet beneath it all, a spark of clarity began to grow. The whisper had not just stopped him, it had awakened him, made him see the world and himself with fresh eyes. He realized that power and wealth could never teach lessons like this, lessons that came from honesty, empathy, and human insight. The cold that had gripped him began to transform, shifting from fear to understanding. He felt gratitude, a deep, unspoken appreciation for the young waitress who had unknowingly done what no one else could. She had reminded him that sometimes the smallest gestures, the simplest words, carried the mightiest force, capable of altering the course of even the most carefully planned life. Finally, after what felt like both an eternity and a few fleeting moments, he picked up his fork again, but with a different mindset. A sense of quiet respect and reflection replaced the earlier shock. He ate slowly, savoring each bite. Yet his thoughts were elsewhere, lingering on the whisper, on the woman who had spoken it, and on the uncomfortable, humbling realization that life's most powerful lessons often came when least expected. By the time he finished his meal, he knew something fundamental had shifted inside him, something that would remain long after the restaurant faded behind him, long after the lights and sounds returned to normal. Her words had frozen him, yes, but they had also awakened him, leaving him profoundly aware that true insight often comes not from control, wealth, or status, but from the courage and wisdom of ordinary people. After the initial shock of her whisper, he remained in his seat, feeling a strange mixture of awe and curiosity. The ordinary restaurant around him seemed to fade, and in its place, a quiet stillness filled the air, as if the world had slowed down to allow a moment of understanding. He watched her move gracefully among the tables, attentive yet unhurried, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a desire to reach out, to connect in a way that wasn't about power, money, or influence. It wasn't just the words she had spoken, it was the way she had spoken them, with honesty, clarity, and courage. He realized that she had seen through the layers he had carefully built over the years, the layers that masked fear, insecurity, and the longing for something real. There was a rare authenticity in her presence, a sense that she cared about people in a way that transcended small talk or politeness, and it drew him in like a magnet. He wanted to say something, anything, but he hesitated, aware that revealing his identity would change everything. He could feel the tension of 1,000 unspoken possibilities pressing down. Yet he also sensed that the connection forming in that moment wasn't about status or recognition. It was about understanding, a shared human experience that needed no explanation, no introductions, no proof of worth. As he observed her from across the table, he noticed subtle details he had missed before, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the careful attention she paid to every customer, the quiet confidence in her movements. Each detail felt like a clue, a glimpse into her character, and with every glance, he felt a deeper pull toward her, a pull not born of attraction, but of respect, admiration, and the need to acknowledge the rare insight she had just shared with him. He realized that the connection wasn't just one-sided. Either, there was something in her approach, her intuition, her quiet awareness, that suggested she had recognized a story behind his calm exterior, a story of someone who had achieved much, yet lost touch with the simple truths of life. For a brief moment, their lives intersected not as billionaire and waitress, but as two people aware of the same invisible threads that connected human experience, a fleeting but undeniable understanding. He felt a warmth spreading inside him, soft, and unthreatening. Unlike the adrenaline that usually coursed through his veins in moments of power or decision-making, this warmth came from humility, from recognition, from the awareness that someone else had truly seen him, not as the world saw him, but as he was, a person, flawed, complex, yearning, and capable of growth. The connection was simple, yet profound. A reminder that sometimes the smallest interactions could leave the deepest impact. As she approached again, carrying a refill of water, their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and he allowed himself a subtle nod of gratitude. She smiled lightly, unaware of the profound effect she had on him, and went about her work, but he felt that silent acknowledgement linger, a bridge between them that required no words, no explanations, just mutual recognition. He thought about the countless hours he had spent surrounded by people who admired him, feared him, or sought favors from him. Yet he realized that none of those interactions had ever reached this level of truth, of connection. It was here, in a modest restaurant, with a woman who had no idea who he truly was, that he had felt seen, understood, and reminded of what truly mattered. He let out a slow breath, the tension in his chest easing slightly, and leaned back, savoring the feeling of genuine connection. Fleeting though it might be, he understood that this moment, small and ordinary to anyone else, was extraordinary for him, a rare reminder that life's most profound lessons often came from the most unexpected sources, from people who carried insight, courage, and truth in their quiet, unassuming ways. By the time she moved away again, he felt subtly changed, as though a door had been unlocked in his mind, a door to humility, empathy, and awareness that could no longer be closed. He knew he would leave the restaurant differently than he had entered, carrying with him the invisible thread of connection she had offered, a thread that would guide his thoughts, decisions, and understanding of the world for a long time to come. He watched her from his corner seat as she moved between tables, carrying plates and refilling drinks with quiet efficiency, and he realized that this ordinary woman had just delivered a lesson he could never have expected. Her whisper had frozen him moments ago, but now, sitting back in his chair, he understood something far deeper, something that wealth, power, and influence could never teach. The revelation washed over him slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like sunlight creeping across a room, until it became impossible to ignore. He had always believed that control was everything, that knowing the outcomes of every decision, predicting every move, and commanding every situation was the measure of success. Yet in that small restaurant, in the simplicity of a meal, he had learned the opposite. The truth was not in the power he wielded or the riches he possessed, but in moments of honesty, courage, and human connection, moments that arrived unexpectedly and left their mark long after. The whisper, delivered so casually by someone who had no idea who he was, had illuminated a truth he had avoided for decades, that despite his accomplishments, despite the adoration and envy of the world, he had been living only half a life, focused on external measures of success while neglecting the quiet, internal measures that truly mattered. His mind raced, replaying every interaction of the evening, every glance, every word, and he saw the full weight of what had just happened. It was not just the words themselves, but the timing, the intention, or perhaps the lack of deliberate intention, that made them so powerful. They had arrived at a moment when he was unguarded, when he was open to seeing life as it truly was, stripped of pretense, stripped of expectation, stripped of influence. And in that vulnerability, the revelation took root, spreading warmth through his chest, even as it unsettled his mind. He realized that he had been searching for this kind of clarity for years, chasing it through boardrooms, luxury homes, private jets, and accolades. But it had always eluded him, always just out of reach, and now, without warning, a stranger had handed it to him effortlessly, simply by speaking the truth, by observing honestly, by daring to notice him, not for what he owned, but for who he was underneath the layers. The irony was not lost on him, that someone with so little in comparison to him materially could wield such influence over his thoughts and emotions. It reminded him that power and wealth were temporary, fleeting, while the impact of insight, kindness, and courage could last a lifetime. He felt a deep respect for her, a recognition of her strength, intelligence, and the unspoken wisdom she carried in her quiet way. She had revealed what so many others could not, or would not, that the most important truths often come from those least expected to deliver them. He thought about the ripple effects of her whisper, how it had shaken him to his core, forcing him to reflect, to question, and to see himself differently. He understood now that revelation is rarely dramatic in the way one expects. It often arrives subtly, disguised as an ordinary moment, a small gesture, a simple word, yet it carries the power to transform perspective completely. For the first time in years, he felt humility, not humiliation, but the kind of humility that clears the mind and softens the heart. He realized that he could leave this restaurant the same way he entered, cloaked in anonymity, or he could take this revelation with him, let it reshape how he lived, how he treated others, and how he saw himself. He chose to carry it with him, knowing that the lesson would guide him far longer than any fortune ever could. As he rose to leave, paying his bill with a quiet generosity that matched the generosity of insight he had just received, he looked once more at the waitress, catching her eye for the briefest moment, and nodded with gratitude, not for the service, not for the food, but for the awakening she had sparked within him. A private revelation had been shared, one that no one else in the restaurant would ever understand, but one that would echo in his life for years to come. Walking out into the cool night, he felt lighter, freer, as though the weight of years of control and expectation had lifted slightly. He had come seeking a meal, anonymity, and perhaps a brief escape, but he was leaving with something infinitely more valuable. A revelation that reminded him that true insight, connection, and wisdom often come from the most unexpected places. He stepped out of the restaurant into the cool night air, the city lights flickering and reflecting on the wet pavement, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the quiet weight of reflection settle over him. The world outside continued as always. Cars rushed by, streetlights glowed softly, and distant voices drifted from other restaurants and cafes. But he moved through it differently, not as a billionaire chasing deals or appearances, but as a man carrying a small, profound change in his heart. The encounter with the waitress, her simple whisper, and the way she had seen him had left an indelible mark. He replayed the evening in his mind, every gesture, every glance, every word, and he realized that what had happened was more than just an interaction. It was a revelation, a turning point, a subtle shift in how he understood himself and the world. The anonymity he had sought at the beginning of the night had been replaced by clarity, and he understood that sometimes the most ordinary moments could carry the most extraordinary lessons. As he walked along the quiet street, he thought about the life he had led, the achievements he had amassed, and the control he had wielded. Yet he understood now that none of it mattered as much as the human connections he had neglected. He remembered the tension of the whisper, the way it had frozen him, the way it had shaken his assumptions and forced him to see beyond his own perspective. He smiled faintly, realizing that true power sometimes came not from wealth or influence, but from insight, humility, and honesty. The memory of the waitress's eyes lingered with him, her quiet confidence and unassuming strength. He wondered about her life, her dreams, her struggles, and he felt a deep, almost protective respect for someone who had unknowingly reminded him of what really mattered. The world outside his private reality suddenly seemed larger, richer, and full of potential connections he had ignored for far too long. He thought about the ripple effect of the evening, how one simple act, a whispered observation, had caused an internal revolution. He realized that life's most powerful lessons often arrive when least expected, delivered by ordinary people who have the courage to notice and speak the truth. He felt gratitude, not just for the lesson, but for the humility it inspired, for the rare moment of being seen without pretense, and for the reminder that no matter how high one rises, there is always more to learn, more to understand, and more to feel. As he moved through the streets, he reflected on how he might carry this revelation forward, not with grand gestures or public declarations, but quietly, in his choices, his attention to others, and the way he allowed himself to experience life without constant control or expectation. The whisper had unlocked a door, and though the world would see him as the same billionaire he had always been, inside, he was subtly, irrevocably changed. He knew he would never forget that evening, that simple restaurant, and the unassuming waitress who had shifted the trajectory of his perspective. It was a lesson in humility, presence, and human connection, and he felt a rare serenity in knowing that he had been given a glimpse of a life he had long neglected, one that valued observation, empathy, and courage over status, appearance, and wealth. As he reached his car, he paused for a moment, looking back at the glowing windows of the restaurant, and he felt a silent acknowledgement, a private nod to the woman who had unknowingly altered his life. Then he smiled, a small, quiet smile, knowing that while the world outside would continue unchanged, he himself had been transformed, carrying forward the whisper that had frozen him cold, but also awakened something vital within him. Driving away, he felt lighter, freer, and more alive than he had in years. The city sped past, neon lights and shadows blurring together, but he held on to the clarity the night had given him, and he understood that life's true richness lay not in power, wealth, or fame, but in unexpected moments, authentic connections, and the courage to see and be seen. And as he disappeared into the night, he carried with him the quiet, enduring truth that would guide him forever, that even the smallest voice, spoken without knowledge of its power, could change a life.